All right. Today we are going to try to cover chapter 6 through 9 in the book of Genesis. Another miracle if that happens. But this is the record of the flood. And when you get your notes, we will be able to follow through this, but you can look on the board for now just to keep an eye on where we are, okay? We've divided the 3 chapters on the flood into 4 headings. The first 13 verses in chapter 6 are the reasons for the flood. God always acts with reason, right? And then verses 14 to the end of chapter 6 and into chapter 7, verse 10, he reveals to us, or revealed to Noah over a period of 120 years plus a week, what it was going to be like, what he wanted Noah to do. He kept talking to Noah. See, that's what revelation means. It means to unveil or to reveal information. So he kept talking to Noah over this long period of time and telling him what he wanted him to do and everything like that, and what God was going to do. And so we've got that in 2 divisions. We have the preliminary preparations that Noah went through in the first 120 years. And then in the last week, chapter 7, verses 1 to 10, talks about the special preparations that God did that revealed to Noah during the last 7 days before the water actually came. And then in verse 11 in chapter 7, and we have the beginning of the flood itself. It says in that verse, at the end of the verse, that all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. See? And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And so at that point, then we have the actual record of the flood. A chronological record of the events, section by section, period by period. And the flood, in the text, the actual history of the flood is broken up into periods of various times because certain events happened during those times. For example, the first 40 days is the time when the rain kept falling. And then after 40 days, there was no more falling rain. During the next 111 days, the main thing that was happening is that the earth was coming to equilibrium, and we'll explain that. What was happening underneath the water. Okay, because it says at the end of 111 days, all of a sudden they began to see the tips of the mountains popping back through the earth, which means that the earth was bouncing back from where it had sunk under all this water. See, it's a little bit like if you're standing on the edge of a lake or something and you throw a big log in the water, it's going to go completely submerged, then it's going to come out of the water and then be submerged again, right? And it'll bounce back and forth, and then after a while it'll float nice and smooth. And I think that, in a sense, that was what was happening with the crust of the earth. It was going like this, and at the first it was totally submerged, and then after a long period it came back up, and that's what explains the going away of the water. It is not that the water was all evaporating. Some of it was, see, but mostly it was the land coming back up out of the water to the place where it is today. And we'll talk about that. See, so during the 1 year and a couple of months that records the actual history of the flood, we have different divisions in which different things were happening. So that's what we'll look at, and that takes us, the end of the flood is actually recorded at chapter 8, verse 14, where the land was dry again. And it could support, people and animals and plant life and everything else. Okay? And then the last section in these, was it 4 chapters? 6, 7, 8, 9, 4 chapters? I've got that wrong on the board. It should be chapter 6 to 9. The last division is the results of the flood. What do we see coming out of the flood? And what new responsibilities did God give to people after the flood? Okay? So, chapter 6 in your Bibles, that's where we are this morning. We'll start right there. I think there are about 10 reasons why God brought the flood. And they're recorded in these 13 verses. They start out fairly general and they get a little bit more specific toward the end, but that's the way I've categorized them. General reasons for the coming of the flood and the specific reasons. I think the first reason is that the world was just too full of sinners. I think that sin, there was just too much sin for God to stomach anymore. Verse 1, "It came to pass when men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all whom they chose." The first phrase is that it was a time when men began to multiply in the face of the earth. Now, people down here today don't like the population growth. A lot of people think that's bad, right? I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with the growth of the population of the world, because God expected that. He commanded people to fill the earth. Well, I think it's a bit of a, that's actually a satanic lie, that there's too much population. Perhaps in some parts of the world there's too much population, and that's only because people haven't spread out. But if you come to northern Ontario, there's lots of room.
Oh, yeah.
You know, maybe not lots of work, but there's lots of room. You know, and there are lots and lots of places in the world where people simply have refused to go. People would rather stay in the cities, and it creates problems. When you get a whole lot of sinners together, you have a whole lot of problems. New York is a terrible place to live compared to Goulais River. You know, and I think that that's the sense of what verse 1 is telling us, that men began to multiply in the face of the earth. It wasn't the fact that there were more people that was the problem. It was the fact of what kind of people they were. They were sinners. They were all descendants of Adam. Okay. The second reason for the flood is implied at the end of verse 2, when it says that daughters were born unto them. Usually in the Bible you don't have a lot of references to women, unless it's a bad reference. In the book of Isaiah, for example, he was a prophet about 8 centuries before Jesus Christ, about 750 years before Christ. And at that point in Jewish history, the society had rebelled against God, and the leaders, who are the king and the priests and the nobles and the prophets and the anybody who was supposed to have spiritual leadership and social leadership, had become rebellious against God. And so what we find in Isaiah is that the women are very prominent. Isaiah doesn't talk too much about the men. He talks a fair amount about the women in his society, that they were prissified and prancing around and bold and brazen and taking over responsibility. And we see that in every degenerating society where women refuse their God-given role to be mothers and wives, and primarily staying in the home and out of the social light. You see, and our society is demonstrating the same problem today. That we've got women who, they have lousy marriages and they're poor mothers, but they want to run for prime minister. That's precisely the problem. Maybe I shouldn't say that too loud, but many of the women in politics today in our country are women who have already failed in their marriages and in their homes. They want the man's position. This is the women's liberation philosophy, and it's a sign of the degenerating times.
Outwardly, woman doesn't look like that, but inside, when I see the abortion movement, woman lesbian movement, it's very related to the woman, the right woman.
That's right. That's right. You just don't see too many women in public places who are defending the pro-life movement, and marriage, and so forth. You just don't see it. Now, once in a while in the scriptures, we do see women having a very prominent godly role. There were some of the judges were women, and Mary was extremely exalted, and Elizabeth, when Jesus was born. God does exalt women. He hasn't got anything against women. It's just that in his plan and program there is order in his world, and he expects people generally to stay, unless he changes it himself sovereignly and exalts somebody individually. And so when it says here that the daughters were born unto them, the implication is, the inference is, especially from what we read after this, is that these daughters were quite the women. You know, it's an allusion to social degeneration. All right?
Nice, there's a couple books in the Old Testament, the names, Ruth and Esther.
That's right.
They're good examples.
God is not anti-woman.
No.
No. But he is anti-women's liberation.
Yes.
All right? Now, the third reason why the flood came is because of an either-or situation. I think that verse 2 and 3 is telling us that there was a demonic infestation of the human race. I think demons came from their place where they were, where they were left to be judged under Satan, and they just went one step lower. Not only had they rebelled against God, but then these spirits in their rebellion decided, no, we're not going to stay here, we're going to go down there because we're attracted to those women down there.
So there's half demon, half people. There's people living today that are genetically from a demon.
Well, we'll talk about it, okay, as we go through this issue, because it's an interpretive question here. Okay. I can't be too dogmatic about what this says, but you need to understand both viewpoints here. And either verse 2, when it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all whom they chose, either that verse is saying that the sons of God are angels, rebellious angels, who left their spiritual place and infested the human race because of a sexual attraction to the women, or that is telling us that there were people from the former godly line of Seth, who were the sons of God, spiritual people who, because of the day in which they lived, they kind of gave up their religion and turned away from God, and themselves became ungodly, and of course there's nothing like being attracted to a woman to put a person's morals to the test. You see, many godly men have been attracted to very godless women just because they were beautiful women, and vice versa too. Many godly women have been attracted to godless men because they were handsome dudes. Right? And so that could be what this verse is talking about. And actually I believe that both are possible. I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive viewpoints. I think both were undoubtedly happening. Well, in fact, the proof that the second viewpoint is true is that there was only one family left. Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, and Noah's wife, the 8 people, there were only 8 righteous people that we know of in the whole civilization, which means then that all of Noah's relatives, extended relatives who had been from the Sethite line and probably had been introduced to God, because Noah had been, you see, that all of the people that he knew from in his distant relatives had become godless, because God destroyed them. That's right.
And so they mixed it, and God hated that because God fundamentally composed resolved to pure life unto the Jesus Christ.
Right. And I believe that. I think that the text supports that. The fact that Noah was the only one left proves that whatever other people from that godly line still existed, were actually had actually become godless, and the implication is that it was because they were attracted to the godless women around them who had come out of the closet, as it were, you know, and had taken a bold place in society. I mean, I myself have walked down Gerrard Street in Toronto, which is downtown Toronto. I've been there, and I was going back to our apartment one evening about 5 or 6 o'clock after we'd been in the hospital all day with Carolyn, and we passed prostitutes on the street. The first time I've ever seen any, face to face, but we walked right past these gals, you know, and there's nothing invisible about a prostitute. I mean, they're out there displaying their wares, and you could tell exactly what they were, you know, and they're not unattractive women. They're physically quite attractive.
The only problem is you don't know if they're a man or a woman.
Well,
I'll tell you that. My uncle knows that for a fact.
Is that right?
Yeah, he stopped. This is in Winnipeg.
Oh.
He stopped. He thought it was a woman.
No.
Yeah.
Is that
Is it
right?
shaking?
No. It was on Main Street in Winnipeg there.
He was looking for one.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, he went looking for one. He'll never do it again. So.
Isn't that?
He learned his lesson.
Isn't that
Yeah.
something?
You never know if they're a man or a woman standing there. Yeah.
But the woman feature is different.
No, you used to be surprised how a man can dress like a woman. Literally.
Well, actually, today men are actually taking estrogen,
Yeah.
you know, to make their bodies change. You know, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Very sad.
Anyway, I think that there's no question that this verse is telling us that the godly people from the Sethite line had actually become godless, you know, and so society had so badly degenerated that you know, God was sick of it, and he was really upset, right? And I actually think that this verse does tell us that there was a demonic infestation. Turn with me to, hold your finger here, because it says here that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. Sons of God. Turn with me to Job chapter 38. That's just before Psalms. Do you have a Schofield?
Yeah.
Okay, it's probably the same as mine then. It's
Yeah.
probably about page 596. We read this section back when we were studying creation on day 1 and 2. But Job 38, verse 4, begins some questioning that God himself is speaking to Job. Right? God is speaking and he's questioning Job. Where were you, he asks, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Declare, Job, if thou hast understanding. Who has laid the measures of it, if you know? Or who has stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are its foundations fastened? Or who has laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud its garment, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and broke up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shalt thou come, but no farther, and here shall thy proud ways be stayed. God is asking, where were you, Job, when I created the world? Where were you when I divided the waters from the land and said, this is as far as the waters are going to go? Where were you? And one of the passing references is that when, I think it's day 2 or 3, when God laid the foundations of the actual earth in the planet Earth, you know, created the planet itself, it says the sons of God, verse 7, shouted for joy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know that isn't a reference to people, because there were no people made until the 6th day. So this has to be a reference to angelic beings. And it suggests that the angels were created either before the created the 7 days of creation, which I don't think they were. I think everything, including the angels, was created during those 7 days. So it means that the angels must have been created on probably day 1 or day 2. Because by day 3, when God divided the waters from the land on the earth, the sons of God, the angelic beings, were all rejoicing.
Sure.
As God did this miraculous work.
That'd be exciting.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about a TV show. You know?
Is there any other references to sons of God in the Bible?
There are. there are references to the Jewish people being called sons of God, right? Some of the prophets were called sons of God, right? So
To be Christian also children of God.
yeah, we're called sons of God. So there are a variety of definitions attached to this phrase "son of God," sons of God, plural, right? And Daniel and his three friends who walked in the fiery furnace were called the sons of God, right? By the heathen king, right? So there is a debated question here: is the reference back in Genesis chapter 6 merely a reference to people, who probably lived in an immoral relationship with all kinds of women, or is it a reference to angelic beings who left their place in heaven or wherever they were consigned in judgment and actually tried to go after strange flesh? Now there are two references in the New Testament proving that that's in fact what was happening here. Go with me to the end of the New Testament to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2. Second Peter, 13:39.
I'm not too.
Yeah, that's all right. Everybody starts somewhere. 1339. There you go. Good, you got it. Okay, now we're in chapter 2. And the second chapter in 2 Peter is about false prophets in the New Testament, false teachers. And God is speaking through Peter to Christians, and he's saying, watch out for these people. And in the process, he says to Christians that, sure, false prophets are going to come in, they're going to wreak havoc in the churches, but God is going to judge these people. And to prove his point that God is going to judge false teachers in our day, he goes back into history and he says, well, look at the examples of God's judgment in the past. Verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. That's case number 1, right? In case number 2, and God spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person, the preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Right? That's case number 2. Case number 3, verse 6, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that should live ungodly. He gives 3 examples from the book of Genesis of God's past judgment on godless people. And so it's a principle with God that sinners won't escape judgment. Okay? Whoever they are, whether they're in the church or out of the church. Now what's interesting about the 3 examples that he gives is that the first one refers to angels who fell. Now this is either referring to the original satanic and angelic rebellion in heaven that Isaiah and Ezekiel talk about, right? And which is talked about in Revelation 12. You follow me? It's either the original angelic rebellion or it's another angelic rebellion, perhaps in chapter 6. Peter doesn't specify it too, he doesn't nail it down. He just refers to an angelic rebellion, and he says, and then he talks about the flood. He suggests that there was an angelic rebellion before the flood. Well, we know that Satan's fall in heaven originally was before the flood. And even if Peter's referring to Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, where the sons of God, angels maybe, cohabited with human women, then it would still fit, right? And then Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't take place until the life of Abraham, many years after Noah. So he could be giving 3 chronological examples of divine judgment. Now to settle the question, you have to go to Jude, the book of Jude. Just keep going towards the back, page 1349. And Jude really makes it specific. Jude is talking about the same problem in the church as Peter was. In the last days, false prophets are going to come into the church. People are going to teach true error, right? And so God is going to judge them. Look at this in verse 5. Jude says, I will therefore put you Christians in remembrance that you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed them that believed not. So that's talking about way later on in the Old Testament, after the book of Genesis, in the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, he talks about judgments on the Jewish people. And the angels who kept not their first estate, verse 6, but left their own habitation, he, God, has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. So Peter and Jude seem to be talking about the same angels, right? He talks about them leaving their place, right? Rebelling against God, and God reserving them in chains in special judgment. There are many evil spirits in the world today that are not chained and bound. They're free to roam the earth and to continue to rebel against God. But there seems to be a special class of angels, you see, that rebelled against God really badly. And so he locked them up.
In a sense, the angels, they fallen from the high heaven.
Right.
So that means fallen means second or third level this situation. In a spiritual sense, they are binding. They cannot go over to the third level.
We don't know where they're bound or anything like that. It's just that there seems to be some that are specially bound and other wicked angels that are still free to...
My point is, they fallen on earth as the disciple zone, so they focus on the human. So that means their boundaries limited is a kind of chain. We are very chained, but we still do something, but it's limited.
I would suggest that it's not that, though, because when Jesus died, it says in 1 Peter chapter 3 that when he died, he went down and preached to the spirits in prison. You know, a place like hell. You know, it's not on earth, it's someplace else. You know, and he preached to them. And I think that he declared to them his victory. You know, so there, and Peter actually says in 1 Peter chapter 3 that it was the spirits that came from Noah's day, which since the time of Noah have been chained. Right? So that reference goes along with this one here. But let me finish this one here because there's a key point here. Jude says that these angels left their first estate and God has judged them in everlasting chains unto the final judgment, just like, or even as, there's the key phrase, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire.
Okay. Even as.
Right.
What is it comparing it to? The acts of Sodom and Gomorrah or the judgment?
Both.
Uh-huh.
You know, why would he put those details in there if they didn't matter?
Because that's how come they got judged.
Well, that's true. But the point is just this, that when the angels were sent by God in Genesis chapter 19 to go from Abram's tent and to go rescue Lot out of Sodom, we know it was two angels. God sent two angels. It actually says they were two angels from God. Right? They walked into the city, but they looked like men. But they were really angels. Two or three. Right? And so they walked up to Lot, they found him late in the day, and they said, we've come to your house, we're taking you out of this town. And he says, oh, you've got to stay the night. And so as they were going through the city streets in the darkness towards Lot's house, all the homosexuals were out, you know, and they were looking for contacts, and they saw these two new guys that they had never seen before. Right away they were attracted to these guys and they wanted them. And they started to pound Lot's door down saying, we want those men. We want those men. So these human perverts were going after what the Bible says, strange flesh. See? They thought they were men, but in fact they were angelic beings, you know, and angels in the Bible always appear like men. never appear like women, they appear like men. Okay? And so human beings were going after strange kind of flesh. It was something that was totally contrary to God's will. God never intended for such a thing to happen. Right? This was perversion at its worst. Okay? Men going after angelic flesh in a sexual fashion. And that sin, which resulted in the judgment, you know...
It's just not that sin.
No, it was that plus all the sodomy and the rebellion and everything else.
He's planning to destroy it before that.
Sure. But that, I think that was the tip of the iceberg, because as soon as they left, as soon as the angels left with Lot and his wife and his daughters, God destroyed the city. And what Jude is saying is that there is an even-as relationship between the sin of these angels who left their habitation, you know, who are going to receive, who are reserved to judgment, and what God did to the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, who went after strange flesh, and therefore God judged them. Okay, that's the way I see it. You know, now
Sure.
You know, we don't have time to go into an exegesis of it, but I'm just simply showing you the viewpoint.
Yeah.
Okay, the support for the viewpoint. The key phrase is even as. What the angels did was something similar to what the Sodomites did in Sodom. They went after strange flesh. Well, actually, it was the reverse. If Genesis chapter 6, verse 3 is saying that the sons of God, angels, went after human women, it was angels going after human flesh, whereas in Sodom it was human flesh going after angels. But it was still the same perversion.
Okay.
Okay, there was a similarity.
Okay. It's the judgment thing. But if you focus on the judgment aspect of it, you know, a lot of that can cut away.
So there's several different view about this. The sons of God is the descendant of Sam, or the following angelic being.
Well, I said I'd talk about it, and I don't want to talk about it
That's
until
it.
I get to that verse, because I will come back to that point. You know, how could demons produce children if that was the interpretation? Before we leave this, I want you to go with me to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18 through 20. 18 through 20. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom, that is, by the Spirit also, he, Christ, went and preached unto the spirits in prison. These are obviously the same individuals that Peter and Jude refers to in those other places. Christ went and preached to these imprisoned spirits, who at one time were disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. To me, that clinches it. You know, that these imprisoned spirits are in fact the spirits that were rebellious in the waiting period, that 120 years period during which Noah was building the ark. It connects it directly to Noah's world in that pre-Noahic time, you see. That it actually says that these were the evil spirits who were disobedient, and it defines when they were disobedient. It says their disobedience was in the days of Noah. Okay? I think that you put those three verses together, and that's enough commentary to prove, you know, that the sons of God back in Genesis chapter 3 were probably both formerly godly people who had turned away from God and who were just giving up their faith and becoming ungodly, as well as on a spiritual dimension, unseen perhaps to the human eye, that there was a spiritual invasion by demons into this world.
So you mean the spirit in prison meaning is angelic being?
Yeah.
But to me is for disobedience. In Korean verse, when I read, there are human who were disobedient in the days of Noah, waiting.
Okay.
When I read it here,
It has the idea of human beings who are disobedient.
The human beings.
Yeah.
The human the Bible sometimes calls the human being the spirit, soul,
Right.
body.
Right.
So when I dead, there's no any more body.
Right.
So we call that in dark the spirit or soul.
Right. And that's possible. Again, I'm not being dogmatic. I'm simply saying if you look at it, it's possible that Peter is describing actual demons. Okay? It is possible that this is a reference simply to the sinners of Noah's day.
Why would Christ preach to sinners or to demons?
Well, we preach for different purposes. You know, sometimes we preach to get people saved. Sometimes we preach to teach people. And sometimes a person preaches to announce things. You know, and it wasn't like he was offering them salvation again, but I think he was probably declaring his victory. You see, announcing his victory in the same sense that the angels appeared out of heaven to announce the birth of the Christ. You see. All right, so that's an interesting sidelight. It's not essential to the understanding of Genesis 6 to believe that these are demons infesting the human race. Okay, I don't, however, see there's any particular contradiction, because what little I read about demonism today, there are very sexually perverted demons known to people today called incubi and succubi. You know, those are the names given to these sexually perverted demons, you know, that are attracted both to men and both to women. You know, and the same thing is in fact a real reality in our world today. We just don't bump into it very often because of the friends we keep, you know, and the life we live, which is good. But if you read the literature, there is such a thing today, that demons seem to have a fascination with human flesh, right? And so I think when you put it all together, I think it's possible. I think it's quite possible. And that would even make the flood even more reasonable, would it not? You know, it's not that it was just a bunch of human beings going wild, but the fact that human beings were in fact being infested by demonic spirits and rebellion, and God hates rebellion. He cast the devil out of heaven for rebellion, and now the devil and some of his horde are wreaking havoc in the world. You know, if you take that all together. Another reason for the flood is that there was profound violence throughout the world. It says in verse 3 and 4, the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. That is a commentary on verse 2. When it says the sons of God took the daughters of men and took them wives of all whom they chose, the next statement is, the Lord said, my spirit isn't going to strive with you people all forever. I'm going to put a stop to this. The implication from verse 3 is that when the sons of God were taking the daughters of men, that this was not a normal thing. It wasn't a proper thing. It wasn't a moral thing. I mean, if you, on the face of it, what's wrong with people getting married?
If we apply the sons of God is a descendant of Sam,
Right.
God tried to wants to preserve their line. And they saw in human eyes, the sons of man is not the God's lining, it's fair, beautiful. And they take a wife. Because God's purpose is preserve the pure descendant, the human purpose is multiply, keep the descendant. To take the wife from others mean the purpose of the human life to multiply and bring up their descendants is totally disturbed by the blood mixed. The point is this: in human eyes, it's beautiful, so it take their wives from the daughters of men. It totally corrupts the purpose of the sons of God's life. The purpose of their living. Their purpose of living is good descendants. But they can expect good descendants because they take their wives from the daughters of men. So human's eye is beautiful. It take the wife mean the purpose of life is corrupted. So just one out.
Yeah. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24 that as it was in the days of Noah, where people were marrying and giving in marriage, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Right? Now, if you read that passage in Matthew 24, it doesn't sound like there's anything particularly wrong with people marrying and giving in marriage. Because, I mean, marriage is lawful. God instituted marriage. Marriage is, in our way of thinking, a good thing, is it not? But if, in fact, as Chang was just commenting, that the marriages were improper marriages between people that shouldn't be getting married.
They're lost for state.
Yeah. Well, just godly with godless, or formerly godly turned godless, marrying godless women. You see, or even if this demonic thing is the right interpretation as well, that demons were getting involved in all this procreation and human relationships, then what we have here is not a reference in either Genesis 6 or Matthew 24 to normal marriage and normal human sexuality, but perversion. See? And I was going through the store about last weekend, and I try not to look at the magazines when I'm going through the checkout, because they always put these half-nude women there, in all these magazines. But I just couldn't help it because I'd never seen anything like this before. There was a picture of Demi Moore, an actress, standing there, and the title on it was, it was advertising in bold letters her perverted sexual activities, even with animals. It said.
The real magazine or
Yeah.
line magazine?
Yeah.
Real magazine?
No, well, it's like the National Enquirer, okay, but I mean, it's still, I know for a fact that stuff happens, in our world today. I've read testimonies of people who are tourists to Egypt, and they thought they were going to Egypt to see the pyramids and all this, and they found themselves downtown Cairo, where all of a sudden the crowd would open up, there'd be a big band, and then some woman would come out there and have sex with an animal. Right on the street.
For the tourists?
For the tourists. To make money, and then people give money. Okay? That's called bestiality. And that's as low as it goes in God's way of thinking, you see. And when Genesis 6 and Matthew 24 is talking about these things, we are not talking about normal human sexuality here. We are talking about every possible conceivable perversion. As it was in the days of Noah, I mean, it was so bad that God destroyed those people. It's going to be so bad at the end of the age that God is going to destroy the world again with fire. First he did it with water, next time he's going to do it with fire. You see? And it's not surprising that when you read the book of Revelation, that when it describes Jesus Christ coming out of heaven, that his tongue is a flaming fire, and he destroys his enemies with fire. At the second advent, you see, to set up his kingdom on earth, he destroys his enemies with fire. Okay? Now we're still on this profound violence thing. God's Spirit is striving with people because of all this perversion that's going on, and so God said, okay, you've got 120 years. The implication, he's not saying that people from now on are going to only live 120 years. He's saying that there's 120 years before I do something about this situation. And the reason that this is not talking about a change in man's longevity is because I checked it out. Chapter 5, the average age of all of these godly people was something like 900 and... I think it was 911 years, the average of the people whose lives, if you don't include Enoch, who is translated. Okay? But after the flood, when you go to chapter 10, it gives us the ages of many of the subsequent people that lived after the flood, Noah's descendants. The average age was 332 years. Yes, maybe. Maybe after Abraham it did eventually go down to 120. So again, you're not being dogmatic, but the text seems to say that because of this violence, and wickedness and perversion, God was going to give these people 120 years to repent and to allow Noah to preach to them and to allow Noah to prepare a boat and so forth, and then the judgment was going to fall. He wasn't going to just everlastingly put up with this.
So this passage can apply two sides. One is God waited 120 years
Yes.
from that time.
And that's the
Or
primary thing.
second is it might be that our human life is average 120 years, and we have to reach up the present situation.
Yeah.
So God give opportunity each human being average 120 years to repent before he died. In a sense,
Again, I can't refute that. I just think that the first one is probably the better interpretation of the two.
Is there other texts that say something about this 120 years, like in
Not
Noah's time?
not of human age. In fact, in the scripture, I think there's a couple more references to the fact that man's days will be 70.
Yeah.
He reduced it to 70 afterwards.
Yeah,
You know,
so this whole time is 120 years.
no,
70.
3 times 20 plus 10,
So 70.
70. Okay. So the the profound violence of the earth. Look at verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days, also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same became mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now this is related back to verse 2, because it refers to the sons of God coming in unto the daughters of men. And there's a clear inference here that the children that they bore were extraordinary children. Okay? Extraordinary children. Now, twice the question's been asked this morning, well, how can a demon, if these are demons, produce a child? And my understanding of the spirit realm is that the spirits themselves are not capable. They're not created with reproductive abilities. Jesus himself said that in heaven there's neither marriage nor giving in marriage. Right? The angels are a finite number. They always appear to be in the masculine, when they're described in human terms in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. Gabriel and Michael and two men that stood on the stone when Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and so forth. They always appear to be men, but there's a finite number of angels. There's nothing in the Bible that suggests that angels reproduce. They have the ability to reproduce at all, right? So my feeling is that when it said, if these were the sons of men being attracted to the bodies of human women, that they have the desires, and the only way they can carry out their desires is to take over the bodies of real men, you see, and cause them to be demon possessed, and then these people just go wild. Now there may be some ability, and Morris suggests this in the textbook, that there may be some ability for the human genetic structure to be affected by just not non-physical factors, by spiritual factors as well. That destruction can take place to create mutations and other kinds of changes that would produce physical effects like giantism. And the word giant here is found. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of men came in. And I don't think that the phenomenon of giantism was necessarily the result of this demonic stuff coming in, but it does say that it appears to have fallen along with this. I think, again, I hate to say what I think, but if you compare what our world in the post-flood time has found out about ancient life forms on this world, we discover that the dinosaurs were at one time huge creatures. Huge creatures, 100 feet long, 200 feet long. Huge skeletons. Their bodies are found all over the world, right? They are lizards they are members. That's what a dinosaur means. A dinosaur means terrible lizard. It's a member of the reptile family. And I've read that the only thing that prevents reptiles in our day from reaching the sizes known to science of reptiles from before is simply that the environment in which they live prevents them. It's much like a goldfish. A goldfish, when kept in a small glass bowl, will remain a small goldfish, but if you put it in a pond, it'll grow to be the size of a carp. There's no end to the growth. It'll just grow and grow and grow. And so the principle that is suggested by these facts is that the reason there were dinosaurs in this early time is because of the tropical climate that was all over the world that was the result of this water canopy. There was a steady state, lush vegetation, there was a profound food chain. There was no end to the food. The earth produced prolifically. The curse had only a few thousand years to operate, or a few hundred years to operate at this time. And so plants grew like we've never seen before, or since, more technically since, and animals grew to sizes that are unimaginable in this environment with all its destructive characteristics. And if animals grew, and if plants grew, why not men? And I think that the footprints that they have found in the Paluxy River down in southern Texas, they found what they believe are human footprints in the exact same rocks with dinosaur tracks, which proves that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. They've actually found tools in the same rock strata, which shows that these were not cavemen, but they were intelligent men. And the footprints are massive footprints. These are big dudes. they were giants. Now there are still giants in our world today, but it's the exception rather than the rule. You see, today it's an anomaly. It's an aberration. You know, I've seen them on television. Okay, usually at fairs and things like that. You know, circuses, they have them, right? But giantism is still being thrown out every once in a while by the human genetic structure today. The possibility is there. Whereas I think back in the beginning, Adam and all of these men, the fact that they lived almost 1,000 years is further evidence that that the potential for growth and not just in terms of longevity but size was there. We just don't normally think of this. We always compare people to us, but I think they were big men. There were giants in the world in those days, and even afterwards, whenever this perversion hit the race, and these people became mighty men, men of renown. Now, these words are not synonyms. The word giant refers probably to physical giantism phenomenon, right? But the reference to mighty men and men of renown is a reference to men with a profoundly violent reputation. The men who followed David. Remember when David was running from Saul in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel? The same word is used to describe the warriors that followed David around the bush when he was being chased by Saul. They were mighty men of old, men of renown. They weren't just your average dude. They were powerful warriors. They were phenomenally violent people. They were just violent people. Now David's men directed their violence against wicked people. You know, they were part of his army and he was doing the right thing. But the suggestion is that Noah's world was filled with very big people who were very powerful physically, and many of whom, especially the ones that seem to have come from these perverted sexual relations between demon-controlled men or godless men who had married these women in these bad relationships, their children became, it seems, men of renown, wild men. Okay? Can you imagine living in a world where there were Tyrannosaurus rexes all over the place? I mean, we have no idea. Like Jurassic Park is, is a theoretical explanation. I don't even think it's scientific in terms, like, I don't think they believe that men actually lived at the same time as the Tyrannosaurus Rex anyway, in the evolutionary theory. It's a good movie, or an interesting movie. It's not good, but the idea is that, according to the Bible, we believe that men and dinosaurs did coexist. Men grew to be big, animals grew to be big, there was lots of food, there was a perfect environment, there were no restrictions.
Generally, is the all dinosaurs extinct after they died in the Noah times?
Yes, I believe that the dinosaur skeletons that are found around the world today were living creatures in the world of Noah, and because of the phenomenal physical changes that happened,
So God
they could not exist anymore.
God didn't want to preserve the dinosaurs because too big.
No, they have been preserved. There are still remnants of the dinosaur species in our world today. They just don't grow to the same size. Crocodiles, alligators, and all kinds of things are part of the same species today. Specific species or kinds have become extinct. There aren't Tyrannosaurus rexes, even small ones, running around today.
If verse 4 is the giants, in the different English version is the Nephilim.
Yeah.
They clearly spelling Nephilim, and the same spelling when we met the numbers, the spy,
Right.
the Dana, Nephilim.
That's right.
So,
Morris points that out, that word giant is Nephilim, which refers to giants, to actual giants. And when the spies went into the land under Joshua, they went through there and said, oh boy, it's a beautiful land, but boy, you should see the people that live there. They're giants, and they live in huge walled cities. There's no way we can fight those guys. There were still strains of giants that persisted for long centuries.
Could have just happened just the same way. People can be demon possessed, and perhaps the same things were happening again.
Perhaps. I prefer myself to explain it in terms of natural phenomenon, rather than to say that every giant is the result of a demon possessed relationship. I think that the demons created wicked giants, whereas there were probably many ordinary huge people that were nice people, or relatively nice compared to those guys. You see, I don't know if you've ever met a demon-possessed person.
I don't think I have. I could have, but I.
Yeah. But the point is that there are, you read the literature today, about, and the stuff that these people do, and the kinds of children and families they produce. It's just horrible. And this was Noah's world. In fact, Morris and creationist scientists believe that many of the not too ancient traditions that have come down even into the 19th and 18th centuries. Remember the knights, the feudal knights that used to go out and fight the dragons?
Yeah.
If you look on the flags of Denmark and Norway and Sweden and many of those European countries, there's even legends today that there is a Loch Ness monster and stuff like that. There is all the probability in the world that there are still the isolated remnants of some of these huge animals, and the book of Job describes two huge animals in the 40th and 41st chapters that make the deep to boil, and flames come out their nostrils and stuff like that. And a lot of people say, oh, that's just mythology. Well, many times myths have a basis in history, in fact. And creationist scientists are of the opinion that it wasn't, even up until the 14 and 1500s in Europe, there were probably still dragons, and some of the descendants of some of these ancient creatures still alive, which made it necessary for a feudal class like the knights class. It wasn't just a political thing, but it was a natural thing. For these guys to run around in all their armor and stuff, and try to kill these creatures. you know, because they were still roaming the world.
Yeah, they're dangerous to society.
Yeah. Much like the wild elephants in South Africa still are a threat to villages and villagers. It's fascinating to think about it, but I think that the picture we are given here is that there was, there was a lot of sin, there was moral degeneration, there was social rebellion, there was demonic infestation, there was spiritual rebellion, no more godly people almost. There was profound violence because of these animals and because of these demon-possessed children. And verse 5, the whole fabric of society was wicked and evil. There wasn't any redeeming features to the existing society. Verse 5, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every imagination.
Yes.
Every.
Some people got to listen to rock and roll. They have it on, they're driving their car, they have it on at their home, have it on their Walkman. It's on all the time. So, yeah.
Well, I can live with a little bit of rock and roll. Maybe I shouldn't say that on the tape, but funky grunge music, now that's too much. You know what I mean? Every imagination of people's hearts. I mean, they can't think a decent thought.
Yeah.
And people act on their philosophy. And statistics are coming out now in our society where lawmakers and law enforcement agencies are amazed at, well, not fact, yeah, they are corrupt them too, shot through the corruption, but they're amazed at the fact that little children now are doing crimes that have never before been seen in our society. Children murdering, serial murders, torture, rape, killing by little children.
That's what they program television.
That's right. People act what they see and hear and believe. Okay? And so this is only a fifth reason. We'll rush through these other ones. It says in verse 6 that God was grieved in his heart. That's a sufficient reason to bring judgment. It repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. God was emotionally affected. It hurt his feelings. Now, we are made in the image and likeness of God. We are his creatures. We have feelings. God has feelings. That's where we got ours. Just like we respond to things emotionally, we are being told here that the flood was in part an emotional response of God. It hurt him really bad, and therefore he acted. And his repentance, we've been through this discussion before. But in this particular case, it specifically connects God's change of thinking to his emotions. Okay? Now that's not saying that God himself went against himself, that he did something that was uncharacteristic, or that he changed his sovereign plan. We know that God's sovereign plan was to allow sin to have its expression in the world. He wasn't surprised by this, but when it actually came about, when he knew that it was going to come about, it hurt him nevertheless. And therefore, as an emotional reaction, he said, now, I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. His thinking went in a direction that it hadn't gone before.
That is belong to the sovereign.
God,
Than
which?
Human when they change, and they following their personal the inability or lost their mind. But the God's change in that situation is belong to his sovereignty, not belong to his change of character. It's not a change of character. It's just sovereign.
We could get off in a long discussion. I don't want to do that. Right? I agree with you that God himself doesn't change. The Bible says he is immutable. He never gives up any of his qualities. He is always just and he's always merciful. Right? And he's always loving, but he always hates evil. Okay? And he's always sovereign. Okay? Well, this isn't proof that God gave up his sovereignty. He didn't change in his nature. This is a response to circumstances.
So there's two kind of concept. Bad kind of concept will change, and good kind of concept change.
That's
So
right.
God, when God seemingly changing is good concept of changing.
Right.
So it belongs to the sovereign Lord. But human changing is, most of the case, is bad.
That's right.
character.
Because we go against our principles. We are inconsistent in our changes. God was not being inconsistent. He was simply demonstrating an aspect of his character here in the flood that had only once before that we know of, or once or twice, in the Garden of Eden and against Cain, been demonstrated. That was his justice. Okay? So justice on the part of God is sovereignly expressed by choice on his part. And in this case, based on circumstances, which he has a right to do. Right? If you saw someone beating an old lady on a downtown street, do you think you'd drive by, or would you stop your car and beat on the beater? You see? You would respond, you would act in a response to an emotion. Right? That itself is the response of information and observation. God saw, says he saw, and he repented. He said, I'm going to do something different here. You see? Why? Because it was an emotional thing.
Because he's a holy, he's a righteous God.
That's right.
His character cannot change it.
That's
When
right.
he see the sin, how can he comprise it?
That's
How
right.
can he let it go?
That's
Because
right.
he cannot change it. He's a good character.
Right.
So he must punish.
Exactly. And so the seventh reason for the flood is that he purposed to destroy both wicked men and the world in which they lived. And he said, verse 7, I will destroy man. See that? I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. Over in verse 13 he says, at the end of the verse, behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Not just the man, but the planet on which man lived. He was going to destroy it. Another reason for judgment is that there was only one man in the whole world that was a righteous man. You can turn that around and see that as a basis for judgment. Why would God judge the world? There's only one left. There's only one good one left. It wasn't that everybody was just bad, but there was only one left. It's the other side of the coin. You see? Verse 8, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Right? Pardon? No, because for two reasons. We know from the chronology that he died the year of the flood. We don't know when he died, okay? But it's obvious if you work on the assumption that long age, especially in Old Testament times, was an evidence of divine blessing. And I found the verse where it says that. I think it's in Deuteronomy. That I will bless you with long life if you will obey me, God said to his people. Okay? Since Methuselah lived longer than anybody else, he might have been one of the most godly people that ever lived, based on that assumption. See?
Oh, you're getting old.
But that is old, and he still had a sin nature, and he still lived under the curse. So I feel that Methuselah died probably of natural causes before the flood came. Okay. And you got to remember that Methuselah was the son of Enoch, who walked with God. It's very doubtful that a man like Enoch would have had a godless son, especially if he walked with God and was such a great saint. How could he have walked with God and raised a godless child? I mean, it happens to people today. Billy Sunday, my understanding, who was a great evangelist in the last century, had a reprobate son, who was not a Christian. But it seems like even Noah's father received a divine revelation, and so Noah's father was doubtlessly raised with the same faith that Methuselah had, that Enoch had, that Seth had. And I just want you to notice, before we leave verse 8, that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This doesn't tell us that Noah earned grace in the eyes of the Lord. It says he found grace. God responded in grace to Noah. It's already inferred from from the next verse that Noah was a righteous man and perfect in his generation as in Noah walked with God. Before God gave this deliverance grace of the flood to Noah, Noah had already demonstrated to God his faith in a life of obedience. He had already been walking with God. He was already a righteous man. He was already a believer. And because he was a believer, standing firm in the middle of a filthy world, God says, I love you. You know, that blesses me. I'm going to show grace to you. See? He did it. It's hard to explain because so many people have great confusion at this point. So many people think that they have to do good in order to convince God to save them. And in a sense, you could try to use these verses to prove that concept. What I'm saying is that there's no question that God saved Noah in this boat because he was a righteous man and because he was obedient, but the fact is that he had started to believe God long before. He was a man of faith, and there are different aspects of salvation. And I was thinking about this last night, just before I quit, at the last page of my notes. God said to Noah in chapter 7, come into the boat. He invited Noah to be saved. But Noah was already spiritually saved. He was already a believer. You can't take that invitation into the boat as synonymous with God inviting lost people to be saved. Romans chapter 10 in the New Testament says that God invites lost people to be saved by putting faith. Call upon the name of the Lord and you will be saved. Then you will get righteousness and you will be saved. That's the order. Believe, and then express your belief in calling on the name of the Lord, right? Then God gives you righteousness. Then you become saved. That's the order that the Bible teaches us. And it applied to Noah. He was already a righteous man because he had been a believer in the message that he received from his forefathers.
Mm-hmm.
He obeyed God. He demonstrated his faith in practice. And he was already a Christian. He was already a believer. Not a Christian, but a righteous man. And to this believer, then God wanted to deliver him in another sense, just like Christians need to be saved every day from all kinds of bad things.
You could use that as an illustration, though. To be saved from judgment, you have to go through the door. If you're either in or out the ark.
But you're going to have major theological problems if you use Noah as an illustration of a lost man getting saved.
Okay, yes.
Okay,
But you can use the ark, though.
The ark, there are general principles that are true of both scenarios. Jesus Christ's work is the basis for the salvation of a person getting saved, and also the basis for the salvation of a man who is saved saved
Sure.
from some aspect of sin in his life.
Yeah, we are going to be saved when we go to heaven, saved
Right.
from the presence of sin.
How about Noah's children and his brother and sister-in-law, daughter-in-law? They believed Noah's saying, and they obeyed Noah's saying. They come in and they believe and they go into the ark.
That's right.
So they are saved.
That's right.
So to believe and obey. I think their righteousness is not any especially good compared with Noah.
Well, it says in verse 9,
Only Noah is righteous.
well, it says Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, plural. It says that, perfect in his generations.
So his children are also righteous?
Well, I think that it implies that Noah had done his job well as a father. He had completed his job. He had passed along spiritually his faith to his children by teaching them like he had been taught, probably, you see. And the very fact that it says in Jude that they were 8 righteous souls. Jude says they were righteous. Okay, so they were all believers.
They demonstrated faith in building the ark.
Yeah.
You know, it's a long project.
Right. Okay, we're going to leave that and take a break and come back and go through the story of the flood. Hopefully, when we get back, all right? Okay. The next division under our study of the flood is chapter 6:14 to 7:10. Let's try to breeze through this here. What we have here is the beginning of God's instructions to Noah. So he's telling him things, revealing things to him. And that's why the heading, right? Revelation about the flood and about the ark. First thing that God talks about is the ark. The word ark itself, it says in verse 14, make thee an ark of gopher wood. The Hebrew word for ark means a chest, a box, something you put something inside to keep something safe. It's the same word that's used in the book of Exodus in the story where Moses was placed into the ark. It was just a little basket made of bulrushes, and then she had tar around the outside and the inside, and blankets on the inside. That was the same word, ark.
The ark went through the Jordan River in the world.
The Jordan River.
They go with the Canaan land, the Joshua.
Yeah.
And then the ark.
Oh, I see.
They go through the river of the Jordan River.
Right.
Before they go to the Canaan promised land.
Yeah. I never thought about all the connections, but that ark went through the water, and Moses' ark was in the water, and this ark was in the water. Water may have the significance of judgment or a point of passage or something. But anyway, it was supposed to be composed of gopher wood, and that word, English word gopher, actually is the actual sound of the Hebrew verb, or the word. It's gopher. And so what they did is they didn't know what kind of wood it was, so they just transliterated the word into English. Probably it was cypress wood, because it would have to be a wood that wouldn't become waterlogged. It'd have to resist water. It'd have to be there for a long time in contact with the water, right? So it was probably a resinous wood, and they suggested it was probably cypress wood. This ark would have rooms. He said, verse 14, rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shall pitch it inside and outside with pitch. We'll talk about the rooms in a minute when we go to the size of the thing. But it says pitch it inside and outside with pitch. The same word for gopher wood is related to the verb kafar. That almost sounds like cover in English, which is the whole idea of the pitch. The pitch in Hebrew was something that covered. Like you slime something on, like tar onto a roof or something, you cover it. And so, and the same word in Hebrew for pitch is the same word that's translated in other places, atonement. Because atonement in the Old Testament was where people's sins were covered over by the, symbolically by the blood of animals. See, as if God can't see my sin now because it's covered with the shedding of blood. You see, and very interesting, connection there. That this ark, the place of safety for Noah and his family, was a place that was made of durable materials that was completely covered in and out. All they could see was the blood. You see, we are safe in Jesus Christ only because Jesus himself was covered with blood, with his own blood. You see. And the sins of people in the Old Testament were only forgiven when they were covered with the blood, see, of animals. All right. Now the rooms shalt thou make in the ark. That's all we know about it. He was just supposed to make places to put all the different animals, and places for the food, and places probably to hold the waste deposits, and places for the people to live in. And here are the dimensions. Verse 15, this is the fashion which shall make of it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth 50 cubits, the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. Now if you just start in your mind's eye with a rectangular object, okay? We'll use this book. In your mind's eye, visualize a rectangular object that's 300 cubits long. A cubit varied in the ancient world from 14 inches to 21 inches. So if you just take a medium cubit at 8 as a foot and a half, makes it easy calculating. Right? A foot and a half for a cubit times 300 is 450 feet. Okay? 450 feet long, that's huge. This building's 80. You know? So that's five times the length of this building. That is a big boat. Okay?
In height.
And it was 45 cubits high, which is the same thing as 75 feet high. 45 plus 27.
70s.
75 feet high. That it's as high as this building is long, standing up, right? And it's 45.
No, it's 45 feet high.
Oh, I'm sorry. 30 cubits high times 1.5 is 45. Yeah, 45 feet high, and it's 50 cubits wide times 1.5 is 75 feet wide. Okay, it's not quite as high as this building is long, and it was as wide as this building is long, and it's 4 times the length of this building, or actually 5.5, 6 times.
Quite long.
Yeah, so, right? And it had to have 3 floors in it. Well, we've got 3 floors. We've got a basement, first and a second floor. Okay, so you can almost just sort of take this and expand it out, and you've got that in a rectangle. Okay, now if you made rooms in that arc on every floor, the same size, the floors the same heights, right? That would make them 15 feet high if they were equidistant, right? Because it's 45 feet high, right? So each room is 15 feet high, and if you made them 15 feet by 15 feet, which is about the same size as your rooms downstairs, except it'd be twice as high,
Yeah.
right? If you made them 15 by 15 by 15, there would be 150 of those rooms on every floor, which is 450 rooms that size in the whole building. Well, that's a phenomenal amount of space, you know? And critics have argued that there's no way that Noah could have taken 2 animals of every kind of species in the world onto one boat with enough food to last them for a year, plus food for humans. Well, a creationist scientist by the name of, what's his first name? John Whitcomb, says that a boat that size, three floors with that much space in it would be the equivalent of 520 railroad boxcars. And in his estimation, only 200 railroad boxcars would have been required, worth of space, would have been required to put representative male and female of the basic species on the ark. And furthermore, it doesn't say God required him to bring mature animals on. He could have brought babies on, you know, which when they matured would be able to reproduce. Okay, so a baby elephant is a whole lot smaller than a couple of big doozies.
Yeah.
All right.
One problem is if you see the dog is more than 100 different species.
Well, it's not really a problem because within the genetic structure of one pair are the variations of all. The potential is there eventually through breeding and crossbreeding and you know, things affecting. I don't know the terminology properly, but I think Morris talks about that.
Yeah.
Okay. That there's enough. All dog characteristics are found in any particular pair. Okay. Just like all possible human variations are found within one particular pair, within the genetic structure. It's there. It's just that it only shows only one set of characteristics can show in any particular generation. Okay. And my explanation, actually we're getting ahead of ourselves, but when Noah's 3 sons spread out throughout the world afterwards, Shem in the Hebrew was his first. Actually, I think they were probably triplets, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It implies that they were all born the same time as his father died in Noah's 500th year. So it's possible that they were triplets. Shem in Hebrew means name, and Jerusalem was the place where where God of Israel placed his name in the temple. And the descendants of Shem became the Semites who lived in the Middle East, all around Palestine and that area, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, in the green area on the map. Okay? The name Ham in Hebrew means hot. And Ham's descendants, Ham and his descendants, are known in history to have settled the hot lands to the south, especially Africa, Ethiopia, and all of that country, and all of their descendants spread out to the hot part of the world south. The equator is south. All right? And Japheth, his name in Hebrew means expanse. And if you look at the continents of the world, the largest continent is Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And history shows that the descendants of Japheth settled to the north of Shem in what today is Russia and Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And of course there was overlapping, some overlapping, but
Sure.
that's essentially the three main areas where these descendants grew up. We're ahead of ourselves here. And so the ark itself was a huge thing. And there's no reason why necessarily the floors had to be the same. He might have made the bottom floor a real tall one, to put the giraffes in and, other tall animals.
Sure, it could have had a hole for one floor or something.
Whatever.
I don't want discussion, but just say and we just forgot. Why didn't Abraham not bring the dinosaurs because it's too big? If dinosaurs was distinguished by the flood, then if the dinosaurs was lived until the flood, then he bring the dinosaurs is too big because the dinosaur species was too big. So it's a question just not.
Yeah, well, I think the answer isn't that difficult. I think that it was God's intent to save the main species, not necessarily every kind within the species. You see, he just wanted to keep the species, the basic species that he had created, and so that the various kinds would not be lost.
The species is suitable to the few after the flood situation.
Well, perhaps he was allowing it to
God
be
could have
done.
just let them all get killed and started over again. He could have just.
But he chose. It says, look at
Yeah.
verse 7, chapter 6, verse 19. And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee.
Mm-hmm.
They shall be male and female, of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind. 2 of every sort shall thou come unto thee to keep them alive. So twice he says that his intent of bringing it was to keep them alive.
Sure.
He could have done it another way, but this is the way he chose.
Give him something to do too.
All right. Okay. And it's not, again, it seems to suggest that God saved the kinds, not necessarily every different specific species within each kind.
Sure.
Okay? So there may have been quite a few specific kinds of species within certain major kinds that did become extinct in the flood. In fact, that seems to be what the evidence shows. There aren't any Tyrannosaurus rexes today, or Diplodocauruses, or whatever, but there are still, the reptile genus, or kind, is still well represented in the world today. Okay? And so there was plenty of space in the ark. And there was a window in the ark. Again, whether it was one window about 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet, by 1 cubit, or whether it was meant to, he was meant to build a window in the top of the ark all the way around, is, again, there's no way for us to know because we weren't given all the information. We don't know what the rooms were like. We don't know what the distribution of space was like. We don't actually know the exact form of the ark itself, whether it was simply left in a box form or whether it was streamlined as well. We don't know that either one of those things. If it was streamlined, then that would reduce the inside capacity somewhat, But even so, there was about 34,000 feet of deck space, square feet of deck space up on top, And when things settled down, there may have been some use even for the top deck. We don't know.
Exercise.
Yeah. Okay. So the plan was to build a boat, and there was only one door. It says, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. And chapter 7, verse 16 says, when the flood came, that they went in, male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut them in. I don't know whether Noah was incapable of shutting the door. That's probably not the explanation, because if he was able to build the boat, he could have probably put pulleys in there. And,
It's a design to shut the door.
yeah, to shut the door. But the fact is that God himself shut the door. Okay? Very great symbolic significance to that, because there was only one door, there's only one way to be saved, there's only one place of salvation, you see. Now, if the ark is to illustrate the salvation of the lost, then there is only one place to be saved, and that is Jesus Christ. And there's only one door, and that is you get in through Jesus himself, who is the door, by faith in Jesus. But if the ark represents, as I think it probably represents, more specifically, salvation in different respects for people who are already righteous people, like Noah was, then Christ again is our place of safety, and the only way to get into Christ is through the ministry of the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians 12:13 says, for by one Spirit are we placed into the body. By one Spirit. That's how people get into Christ. You see. And either way, there's only one way, and God is sovereignly in control of that way. The Holy Spirit is God, right? And he sovereignly takes you. We didn't feel it when we got saved, but he placed